It's a video extra from the Mossad Files, the weekly audio podcast focused on strategic issues in the Middle East, especially regarding Israel, and when possible, talking about Israel's spy agency, the Mossad. But we go broader than that. And at a time like this, when there's a war in the Middle East, the U.S. and Israel together attacked Iran last year, a 12-day war, and this year, since February 28th, we turn to, frankly, one of the leading experts on U.S. Israel relations, because you, Ambassador Dennis Ross, were so involved in that. Thank you for joining me here on the Mossad Files. Of course, you are a distinguished fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. You were a Middle East mediator for several American presidents. In fact, you wrote a memoir about that called The Missing Piece. And much more recently, you're the author of books, including Statecraft 2.0, What America Needs to Lead in a Multipolar World. So, Dennis Ross, welcome. And I'd like your assessment of America trying to lead in this multipolar world. The president is Donald Trump. A decision made in February, obviously, to strike Iran, to work with Israel. And to many critics, it's been very frustrating, if not a failure. What's your assessment as of now?
I think it's too soon to judge whether it's a failure. I think it's not too soon to judge the application of statecraft. The essence of good statecraft is you marry objectives and means. The problem here was a confusion of objectives. If the aim of this war was to weaken Iran to the point where it could not militarily be threatening its neighbors, that should have been the focus of the objectives. If the aim was regime change, it was probably a folly to begin with, because regime change from the air is never going to be necessarily the result. But by confusing, are we weakening the regime so it can't threaten others, or are we trying to collapse the regime because we want regime change? Two very different implications in terms of the means. Again, I come back to objectives and means. If we had attacked only the military capabilities, but held in reserve the threat against the regime, you would have seen the regime not close the Straits of Hormuz. They have not made an effort to close the Strait of Hormuz since 1987-88. And the reason was they understood that would mean a war and it would threaten the regime. Regime survival has always been the most important priority. So we gave the Iranians a strategic card which they didn't have before. It affects our oil prices, it affects the global economy, it gives them a kind of whip hand that they didn't have. So here it was because of the confusion and objectives in terms of what we were trying to achieve. We certainly have got launched on a pathway that doesn't allow us to bring an easier early conclusion to this war. We see the president signal verbally. He constantly is saying we're on the brink of an agreement. Again, for someone who is negotiating, when you emphasize you're on the brink of an agreement, you tell the other side they don't have to do anything. And Iran basically sits back. We're now seeing, even as we speak, the president is ratcheting up what we're doing in terms of force. What I'm especially struck by is that in 2 days of strikes, and last night include 48 tomahawks were fired, we did not go after the targets the president has been threatening. We did not go after power plants. We went after more of the regime military capabilities. In some cases, a water plant was apparently hit as well. But my point is, the U.S. did that alone. Israel was not part of that. That meant that the president is still using force to signal diplomatically, but he wants to try to contain this, and that's why he did not want the Israelis taking part. So here we see more of an effort at calibration than we've seen before, more of an effort not just to use his words, but to combine the use of force with an interest in diplomacy. Same time, the Qataris are offering a new draft. I don't know that we're going to see an end of the war right now, but we see a kind of posturing with the use of force. Sometimes that can work if the other side is really looking for a way out. Sometimes all it does is run the risk of greater escalation. Too soon to know where we are.
Well, we're speaking on Thursday, June 11th, as you refer to what, well, the world's media say could be a resumption of the kinetic war. But you're describing it, in fact, as an attempt to apply pressure on Iran to affect the negotiations. But is it clear what President Trump wants in the negotiations? Or you've worked in the White House, most recently in the Obama White House. Um, Sometimes an administration has objectives, but doesn't tell the media. And maybe it's not even a great idea to announce your objectives if you have a clear set.
This is a really important question because an important part of good statecraft is framing the issues. You frame the issues so everybody has a reason to identify with what you're trying to achieve. President Trump was muddled on the objectives, rarely consistent on the objectives. I think that was the case because he didn't want to identify an objective until it was over, and then he could claim he achieved the objective after the fact. Okay, that makes sense at one level, but it denies you the ability to explain to your own public and the rest of the world what this is about, why you're doing it, why was it necessary now? From the very beginning, he should have laid that out. And he could have said, look, in the case of even though I said we obliterated their nuclear infrastructure last June, the fact is that they were moving in some areas related to their nuclear infrastructure. We know that they had a couple of cascades in a number of places.
For uranium enrichment, yes.
They were not giving up on that. And we saw them reconstituting their ballistic missile capability. And that clearly is a threat to the region and a threat to everyone else. We can't live with a regime that isn't giving up the pursuit of a nuclear weapons capability. And we can't live with a regime that is developing the means to be able to deliver it. So maybe if he had explained it that way and then said, if they're prepared to agree not to pursue this in a way that's credible, this war can end. I mean, now he still seems to be implying they can't have a nuclear weapon. Not implying, he's saying it. The question is, how is what we're doing now related to that? It seems that he's trying to get better terms on the memorandum of understanding that has been negotiated, which he made some amendments to a little over a week ago. And he clearly wants something more in that memorandum of understanding that suggests on the nuclear issue, which is to be negotiated once you have this memorandum of understanding. Once you have that, then you negotiate over 60 days on the nuclear issue. Will we get there? I suspect at some point, yes, because at some point both sides want this to end. It's just not clear how soon that's going to be.
How do you deal with this kind of asymmetry? And I know you have in the past in Middle East negotiations, and that is that some of the countries are democracies with a very active press, with leaders who have to seek re-election or face a midterm election. And the other side, some of the parties are not democracies. They don't have to explain anything to their public, or they can just oppress rebels like the Iranian regime does. So how do you deal with that imbalance?
Well, obviously it compounds what you're trying to do. It makes it, in some cases, you're obviously referring to Israel. Israel has a very vibrant press, but it's beyond that. Israel's about to face an election. Everything will be seen through the lens of that election. I think one of the things that is driving President Trump is he doesn't want Israel to determine how this is going to end because he thinks that a more open-ended approach to it. He wants to be able to find how this is going to end, and he's saying it very clearly. But the more he looks like he controls Prime Minister Netanyahu, the greater the pressure on Prime Minister Netanyahu to show that he will do what is necessary for Israel. We've seen this over the last couple of days. I still think it's very difficult for Prime Minister Netanyahu to do something if President Trump says don't do it.
And of course, Israel's goals in this war were probably not the same as President Trump's, or maybe Netanyahu and Trump had spoken together so much in the run-up to February 28th that the goals were almost identical then. They've certainly diverged, yes?
That is really a very interesting point. We have the Vice President of the United States saying that the U.S. and Israel's interests are different. That's a remarkable thing to say, given how closely the U.S. and the Israeli military have worked together. We have never had, not just with Israel, I cannot think of another example of any American ally that was working so hand in glove, operationally, intelligence, the way the U.S. and Israel, our militaries have been working together. Obviously, we didn't go into this with diverging interests. To have the Vice President of the United States suggest that we have diverging interests is kind of an indicator. It's hard to believe he would say that if it wasn't something that he knew President Trump was prepared to accept as well.
Well, analyze this even from the outside, right? You're close to U.S. government. You speak with relevant officials and experts. Don't hold back. It could well be that J.D. Vance, the vice president, has his own political aspirations, his own view of U.S. foreign policy. He may be detecting what's well known from opinion polls that Americans are not so supportive of Israel as they were for decades. More sympathy with the Palestinian cause than with Israel, polls show. So Vance might be responding to that, wanting to put some daylight between the U.S. and Israel.
I think there is every likelihood of that. It still is remarkable because if he's creating a space from the president, that's not something this president seems to tolerate. So it's hard to believe that he would be saying it unless the president had also said it's okay to do that, meaning he wants to send that signal. He may not want to say it himself, but he wants to send that signal.
Well,
He's
and
been
add to
pretty
that,
blunt in
and
interviews.
add to that, Ambassador Ross, the occasional statements by President Trump that he's angry at Netanyahu, right? We're friends, but we often disagree. Trump's already said that.
Right. Well, I do think, look, there is an interesting reality right now. Trump wants this war to end. It's not necessarily in Bibi's interest for it to end at this point because there's not been enough damage done to Iran's ability to threaten Israel with its ballistic missile forces. Now, the truth is 90% of the defense industrial base has been severely damaged, and that will affect their ability to reconstitute the ballistic missiles. But according to most estimates, they may still have 1,000 ballistic missiles that have the range to hit Israel. And I think that from Israel's standpoint, they probably want to do something more about that before the war ends. You'll note, Dan, that we don't hear the president talking about Iranian ballistic missiles. We really don't hear him talking about the proxies. It's only the nuclear issue. So here you see the gap between where the president is and I suspect where the prime minister is.
Okay, and while President Trump probably wants to weaken the Islamic regime in Iran, he doesn't much talk about that. He talks about cooperating with them. He sets up a parallel with what happened in Venezuela, where the U.S. removed the president and now gets along great with Venezuela, how all that affects the oil market. Those are topics that President Trump has been speaking about in recent days, and they do not match Israeli goals. So it would be remarkable if Prime Minister Netanyahu, Bibi, as you put it, would be able to maneuver, direct, suggest to President Trump that even the goals be altered, or is it too late for the Israelis?
Look, again, I think we're kind of highlighting that what started off as a war of complete convergence and cooperation and unparalleled partnership is beginning to show signs of real divergence. Think about it. We know that Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff in their negotiations were offering sanctions relief and even talking about investing and building up Tehran. In a sense, with this regime, giving this regime an economic lifeline. I wrote a piece in the Washington Post this week where I talked about when the war is over, the Iranian regime has to deal with its fundamental contradiction. And they will want to rebuild their defense industrial base, which will cost an enormous amount. But this is a regime that fails in governance. It can't provide water. It can't provide electricity. Its currency has no value. The civilian economy has been decimated too. So they have real limited means to contend with these inner contradictions. Giving them an economic lifeline buys them time and makes it easier to make some choices.
Okay, I see that warning, but when I read your piece in the Washington Post, and people ought to do so, I also felt you were being a little bit of an optimist, and why not, finding a sliver of light in which the agreement, assuming there will be one eventually, could well weaken the Islamic regime because it will become apparent to the Iranian people that their government is failing them. And it could take a long time, right? But it could lead to real change.
I I do believe that the longer the realities on the inside are such that they won't be able to manage those inner contradictions. Now we know they will use whatever force it takes to try to stay in power. They will kill as much as they think they have to. Having said that, there already are signs there were those within the regime itself who are worried about the direction. So your point is right. When I say you could see a change come, I'm not talking immediately. I'm not talking 6 months. I'm talking over the next couple of years. But that's also reason not to be giving this regime an economic lifeline.
Ambassador, that reminds me of what people close to the now former Mossad director, David Dedi Barnea, said during his last weeks. His faction, in effect, said, "Oh, we didn't promise President Trump that this war would lead to regime change and the people of Iran rising up. And we had an idea, apparently, that Kurdish fighters could march toward Tehran and cause a lot of trouble to the regime." But according to Barnea's people, his idea was this would start a process. Now, does that kind of make sense to you? And was there a process of a slow coup d'état getting underway by attacking Iran in the last day of February?
I definitely think there probably was such a plan, but it seems to have been aborted very quickly. Whether using the Kurds, in fact, would have been a trigger, hard for me to say. I do think the approach should have been, as I said, weaken the regime's capability to threaten others, end the war with that, and then let them have to deal with the consequences of their own internal failing. Not so much a slow process coup d'etat, but a reality where the inner contradictions ultimately bring what I call the emergence of an Iranian Gorbachev. The supreme leader, when I wrote the book Statecraft 2.0, I did a very long chapter on Iran in it. And I went through and I read about 50 of the Ali Khamenei's speeches from the 1990s to 2024. Apart from being mind-numbing, I will say there were some very consistent themes, one of which was his deep-seated, profound fear of Gorbachev, of an Iranian Gorbachev emerging. That he saw as a threat to the, quote, revolution, to the Islamic Republic. An Iranian Gorbachev would do. Gorbachev wasn't trying to end the Soviet system. He thought you had to reform it to save it. And that's what an Iranian Gorbachev would be about. Look, we won't be able to survive unless we change this system on the inside, elevate the domestic construction, reach out to the public, end your isolation and confrontation with the rest of the world.
And I'll remind our viewers and listeners that Dennis Ross was considered a major expert on the Soviet Union before turning full time to the Middle East. Just a final point, if I may, because I know over the years you've been in close touch with so many of the Arabian Gulf countries. Where do they find themselves right now, having been attacked by Iran? Iran saying it's because there are U.S. bases there. But what's going on? What will those Arab countries do? Get closer to the U.S., closer to Israel? Or are they afraid of Iran and they won't do that?
I think the normal tendency on part of most of them, on the one hand, was to feel betrayed by the Iranians because they felt they had done a kind of outreach. But by the same token, I think they'll hedge their bets. The one exception is probably the Emirates, the UAE, maybe the Emirates and Bahrain together. Because in their case, the Israelis came to their defense in a way that exceeded the way we had come to their defense. Israel shared, after all, the Iron Dome with a contingent of people who run it. I think from the UAE standpoint, think about it, they've kind of made their bet. They pulled out of OPEC. That suggests they're very much going their own way. They see Israel as being the natural partner. The other GCC states, I don't see doing that. I don't see any early normalization. I do think there'll be a natural tendency to hedge bets. The one country that will do much better in the aftermath of this is Ukraine, because Ukraine was quick also to help with anti-drone technology. They've kind of perfected it. Israel actually could do more with Ukraine than it has done and probably should have. And that, I think, will be a boost to the Ukrainians vis-a-vis the Russians. So this will have an effect beyond the region. I wouldn't expect that the Gulf states are going to suddenly openly embrace Iran, but I would suspect that there'll be a lot of the under-table dealings with Iran in the aftermath, notwithstanding there'll be zero trust. I do think that one of the things we're going to see massive investments in developing infrastructure to avoid the Strait of Hormuz. The India Middle East economic corridor, I would expect you're going to see a major boost there. UAE will invest a lot of it, but the Saudis will as well. There's already talk of the Saudis and the Turks developing a rail system that doesn't go through Israel, but they could go through Syria. All of this would be part of building new infrastructure. I would be leery of those who say there's going to be whole new alignments in the region. I think there's going to be a lot of stock taking and settling. I would assume we're not going to see totally different pathways emerge anytime soon, other than investment in infrastructure and maybe some greater regional integration in terms of air and missile defense and defense against drones.
For more stability in the world economy, a different way of getting oil out of the Gulf region. And of course, things may change with Israel's election expected, well, required by the end of October. And things may change. Such a dynamic region. Again, we're speaking on Thursday, June 11th. That's Ambassador Dennis Ross, Distinguished Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, author of books including, as you heard, Statecraft 2.0. Dennis Ross, thank you very much for speaking with me.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
My thanks to all of you for watching this video extra from the Mossad Files. Every week there's an audio podcast on all the audio podcast platforms. Just look for the Mossad Files. You can subscribe, download, maybe leave a positive comment, a review if you would. And until next week, I'm Dan Raviv.